Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ben Eike, and I manage training and development at the Levin Center's State Oversight Academy. The State Oversight Academy is dedicated to promoting effective bipartisan fact-finding and oversight by state legislatures as essential to good governance and democracy. Thank you for joining us. In Michigan and California, voters empowered independent citizen commissions to draft and approve new legislative and congressional district maps, instead of leaving that job to state legislatures, state lawmakers. In the 2022 elections and their aftermath, we saw the impact of these citizen redistricting commissions and are now in a position to begin asking some key questions. How did this independent citizen commission approach compare to redistricting done by state legislatures? Did independent citizen-led commissions make elections fairer, prevent gerrymandering, and improve representation for minority populations as their proponents promised? Were there problems or challenges that arose during the process that we should recognize and attempt to remedy? Today, I will be moderating this webinar, and I'm thrilled to be joined by three leading scholars who study the redrawing of legislative boundaries. Please welcome Professor Sara Sadhwani from Pomona College. Professor Sadhwani is an assistant professor of politics, specializing in Asian American and Latino voting behavior, elections, interest groups, and representation. She was recently selected to serve on the Citizens Redistricting Commission for the state of California. Our second panelist is Professor Christian Grosz, professor of political science and public policy at the University of Southern California and academic director of the Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy. Professor Grosz is an expert in political reforms and voting rights, including independent redistricting commissions. He has served as an expert consultant and witness in redistricting and voting rights cases. Our third panelist is Professor Marjorie Sarbaugh-Thompson, professor of political science at Wayne State University and academic director of the State Oversight Academy. Her primary research and teaching interests revolve around policymaking and change in public sector organizations. Further, her research focuses on state legislative term limits and legislative oversight of the executive branch. To start, each panelist will provide a broad overview of the commission approach and briefly compare commission results to redistricting done by state legislatures. Discussion and audience Q&A will follow. To begin, I invite Marjorie to begin her overview of Michigan's commission.
Thank you. I'm going to share some slides with everybody just to keep myself organized and not ramble on too much, because there is so much that you could say about Michigan's redistricting commission. So hopefully you're seeing something on your screen that says key features of Michigan's redistricting commission. Basically, Michigan emphasized citizen in the Citizen Redistricting Commission. And they also emphasized heavily a nonpartisan system where there wouldn't be an opportunity for there to be a deadlock that would throw the system back to the legislature. So compared to other commissions, there are more nonpartisan members on Michigan's commission than any other state commission. They have 5 nonpartisan members, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. Ordinary citizens can serve on Michigan's redistricting commission, which is not true even of some of the other citizen systems. Often there's a screening, pre-screening for expertise and so on. Michigan had solicited and unsolicited applicants. So the Secretary of State was required to send out to a random sample of Michigan voters applications to be on the commission, as well as accepting volunteers who heard about it because they're politically active and they knew all this was coming and applied. So there were 2 pools, the sort of the politically engaged and the much more ordinary average person who doesn't pay that much attention to politics. Also, there's an opportunity for the Secretary of State to weight the applications. Ours did this last time. She weighted it by age, gender, ethnicity, and region of the state in an effort to make sure that the commission was representative of the broad population of the state of Michigan. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, about Michigan's commission is that there is language in the constitutional amendment, and this amendment is 4 pages single-spaced of a PDF document, so it's incredibly detailed. There is language in there that states how much money the state legislature must appropriate in order to fund the commission. For example, the commissioners are paid 25% of the governor's salary. There are all sorts of details in there. There's paid staff, and the Secretary of State's office has to provide technical assistance and has a budget to hire outside experts. It's an incredibly open, transparent process. There were 38 public meetings. All meetings have to be in public. And citizens and commissioners could all submit maps to the commission. I got online and tried out the software, and you could draw your own map and send it in and have it considered with all the other maps. The role of the legislature is really minimized in Michigan. They are allowed to strike a few commissioners or a few volunteers, potential commissioners from the final selection pool. That's all they're allowed to do. So each party has a set number, I think it's 5 or 6 names that they can block after there's been an initial first stage random drawing. And then they go back and draw randomly from that. That's the only role the legislature gets to play. Then the next thing is that there are quite a few criteria for selecting the map. Some of them are compactness of districts and partisan fairness, but there's also something called communities of interest, which is a little vague, but it's supposed to try and put people together who might have shared interests. Ben and I were talking before the panel started about a district that runs up the coastline of Lake Michigan that has a whole bunch of small resort communities that rely on tourism from the lake, and it might look like it's not entirely rectangular. It's not. It's kind of long and lean, but this was to preserve communities of interest. And then there's, of course, compliance with Voting Rights Acts and other laws. The key thing that I think is really interesting is how the final maps are chosen, and that there is no way for there to be a deadlock in Michigan that throws it back to the legislature or leaves us without a map. So the final maps have to be approved by 7 commissioners, 3 of the nonpartisan, 3 of those 5 nonpartisan ones, at least 2 of the 4 Democrats, at least 2 of the 4 Republicans. So you have to have bipartisan support for the map. If no map achieved that, which luckily all 3 maps got that on the first round this year, but it could happen that it would be hung. Then every commissioner can submit their own map. All those maps are rank ordered. And then if you can find a bipartisan winning map out of that, then it wins. If there still isn't a winning map, then all those final maps get dumped into a pool and they randomly draw one out, and that's it. And so there's the threat that there could be a random drawing of a map you really, really don't like. So there's some push to get people to come to a compromise. Now, our first time out, this is the first time Michigan has used this system. Comparing it to the map that was drawn by a Republican trifecta in 2012, based on the 2010 census, the 2022 map has a much more balanced seats to votes ratio. It's nearly 1 for both parties, where it was quite lopsided before. The lopsided margins measure, there are lots of different ways to measure maps for those of you who don't read these constantly. The lopsided margins maps are measures are much more balanced in 2022 than they were in 2012. And a bunch of experts, one of them being Plan Score, which you can find Plan Score's website and look at their assessment. They say that the old map had a 12% Republican bias, whereas the current map has a 1 to 4% Republican bias, depending on the measure you use. But the most powerful thing to me is to look at our congressional districts in the Detroit metro area. If you look, the old map had this crazy district that goes all down here along the suburbs, along the edge of Detroit, goes across the northern suburbs of Detroit, snakes up here, and then grabs the city of Pontiac. The 11th district is sort of like this strange nautilus that goes around here. And one of these little connecting pieces in the 11th district is a shorter distance than it is from home plate to the outfield fence in Comerica Park. So we always joke that a really good Tigers batter can hit a ball across chunks of this district. So, you know, there are some really odd shapes here. Michigan is hard to draw completely rectangular districts because we have islands and coasts and all of that sort of thing. And in the Detroit metro area, people were trying to deal with the Voting Rights Act issues of representation for African-American voters. So you have a few things that, you know, look like they could be more rectangular, but by and large, the 2020 map, just looking at it, is much closer to rectangles than the 2010 map was. So I will turn it over to the rest of the folks and let them talk about other states and what else has happened.
Thank you, Marjorie. The only thing that jumps to my mind with the way the Tigers have played this year, I don't know if we have very many batters that can hit the ball that far.
Well,
but it's a great visual. Thank you.
The Tigers year.
At this moment, I'll transition to Professor Sadhwani. Sara?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben, for having me. It's very exciting to be here. Of course, I come from the perspective both of a political scientist who studies elections and voting behavior, and also having had the opportunity to serve on California's 2020 Citizens Redistricting Commission. The commission was adopted back in 2008 during the Schwarzenegger administration, and is largely seen as the gold standard nationally, and our process is somewhat different from the Michigan model. Initially in 2020, we had over 20,000 applicants, people self-select wanting to serve, and I was one of those applicants. Who ultimately, that pool of 20,000 applicants gets whittled down to a 14-member body. It was a rigorous selection process, which was run by our state auditor's office. All of those meetings for the selection process were conducted publicly under the very strong transparency laws in the state of California, with all sorts of advocates and community groups weighing in even on the candidates themselves. And to me, I think this is a really key and crucial component to our setup of the commission in California. It allows for a very thorough vetting of the potential commissioners. And throughout that process, candidates are asked to write a number of essays, get letters of recommendation. Public comment is made on them from any member of the public. And then a smaller group is invited for interviews. The state legislature, the leadership of both the Democratic and Republican parties, has the opportunity to strike names from the list. And then finally, the first 8 of those commissioners are selected through a random lottery draw. And the first 8 will ultimately select the final 6, keeping in mind the kinds of diversity issues that we might want to compensate for. In this case, when the first 8 were selected, which is how I was selected through the random lottery draw, there were no Latinos on the selected as a part of the first 8, which in California, in a state that's nearly majority minority, with Latinos of a population of over 40% of the population, this was seen as a real miss of the random lottery draw. And I know others have written about this issue as well. And so it was incumbent upon the first 8 to ensure that Latino representation made its way onto the commission representation, as well as representation of East Asians, one of the largest groups, Asian American groups in the state of California. We also looked at things like geographic representation. California is a huge state. We have nearly 40 million people living in the Golden State. We wanted to ensure that there was representation not only from the Bay Area and Los Angeles, the large urban centers, but also from the Inland Empire, the Central Valley, the further northern rural areas of California to the greatest extent possible. And so that two-step process that we have was really essential to ensuring that kind of representation. Throughout the process, we faced numerous challenges, most especially the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant that as commissioners, we did not meet in person for over a year. We were doing our work to establish the commission, which not only includes drawing the lines, but actually creating a fully formed and functioning office that can help support our work as well, figuring out things like government contracts. There were all sorts of these kinds of administrative elements that simply no one else would help us with, because we were truly an independent body. So we could not look to the legislature or to the governor to support us in those ways. So we had to hire our own staff to oversee and carry out those kinds of functions, hiring legal counsel, for example. And throughout that process, we were also conducting a series of outreach initiatives to ensure that Californians knew about the process. The key, in my mind, to independent redistricting commissions that are truly independent and not partisan commissions, which would be appointees of legislators themselves, is transparency and community involvement, right? Transparency was already happening, right? Because we were guided by a set of laws through the state of California. But to ensure community involvement in a process that happens once every 10 years, that isn't something that ordinary citizens are necessarily thinking a whole lot about, we spent a significant amount of time, extra time that we received due to the pandemic and the delay in the census data, doing this level of outreach to community groups, to business organizations, to PTAs, to make sure that ordinary Californians knew about the process and knew how to be involved in the process. And the result is something I think we feel very proud of. We dramatically expanded opportunities for Latino and Asian American representation in the state. These are two communities that have grown exponentially over the last 10 and 20 years, while maintaining opportunities for Black representation. We received more than 40,000 pieces of community input and testimony about communities of interest, everything from environmental concerns, communities living along mountain ranges and ocean lines who had concerns about recreational usage and the degradation of the environment, to business communities. Areas in Orange County around Disneyland that really wanted to keep their interests together. And we did our best throughout that process to make sure that as many of those communities of interest could be kept together, maybe not in all of our maps, but at least in some. So we worked on a consensus model. And I think one of the things that we are all most proud of is that at the end of the day, we had a unanimous vote on our maps, on all three maps, drawing for the state legislature, for Congress, and our Board of Equalization, which is another layer of governance here in California. And it's pretty rare that you see that these days, to see 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents all coming together to vote unanimously on anything felt like a pretty big deal to us. And it's something we're very proud of. We have not faced a single lawsuit against our maps. And we see this as absolutely a very big win for ourselves, but also more importantly for the people of California and for fair representation here in the Golden State. I have plenty more that I can share, but I'll leave that for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Sadhwani. I'm thankful that you were able to be here and be a part of the panel. Looking forward to more discussion on your personal experience serving on the commission, and then your research. It's just it's a great fit. So thank you for taking the time. Transition over to Professor Christian Gross.
Yeah, thanks. I want to give a national overview. We've heard some really great stuff about how things worked in Michigan, how things worked in California. I wrote a report recently in partnership with the League of Women Voters in California and Common Cause California. Oops, that I'm putting this report in the chat. And it's about California, but a lot of the report at the beginning talks about how things work nationally. And so, you know, in 2022, there are basically 4 states that I would say are true commissions, not hybrids, but true commissions. 3 of those I think are more independent than a 4th. But when we think about independent commissions, people tend to think about Arizona, which is one of the very first to do a commission, California, Colorado, and Michigan. And so California was the first big state to implement a truly independent commission, and probably the first real independent commission, because I think Arizona still has some. 4 of the 5 appointees to Arizona's commission are appointed by legislators, but California's are not, as Professor Sadhwani discussed. But then in the last cycle, we had Michigan and Colorado get added. And what that means is about 20% of the country's congressional districts were drawn by a commission just within those 4 states, right? And if we go back 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case at all, right? And so legislatures used to draw the lines everywhere. Still, legislatures draw the lines in many places. But, you know, we're starting to get to a decent number of members of Congress are coming from districts in which commissions are drawing the lines. You add litigation on top of that. There is a lot of litigation in the 2022 cycle in states outside of commissions. Approximately 20% of congressional districts were drawn by courts or were drawn by bodies that had to redo their lines after the court said they had to redraw them. So courts intervened or actually drew the lines in about 20% of districts. So what does that mean? Not even counting hybrid commissions and places that have hybrids between legislatures and independent commissions, you know, that means almost 40% of congressional districts were drawn by somebody beside legislators in the cycle that we're currently in. And that's really historic and something that I think we haven't noticed is this, because this is usually a state by state process where one state puts in a new commission or one state introduces maybe new rules at the legislative level for how legislators draw lines. There's been a shift in the US over the last couple of decades between litigation and between commissions where just legislatures aren't drawing the lines as much as they used to, or the final maps are not being produced by legislatures. And I think that's important. The other big thing that happened nationally that I want to talk about is there is a lot of variation in how lines are drawn, even by legislatures and even by commissions, right? We've already heard a little bit of the differences between California's process and Michigan's process. Selection of commissioners is different. You know, the ultimate rules for what happens if there's a deadlock differs quite a bit, right? Virginia has a hybrid commission that deadlocked and that ended up sending it out. California and Michigan has different rules. And then within legislatures, there's also rules that vary as well. Some states, even though the legislatures draw the line, still have transparency requirements that are greater than others. Some states have no hearings at all or nearly no hearings. So like the Wisconsin legislative process, for instance, in the 2022 cycle, and I talk about this in my report, you know, only had a handful of hours of public meetings and inputs on their redistricting process. And you contrast that to California or Michigan that had, you know, public meetings available on Zoom for anyone to watch. Also, legislatures are constrained as well as commissions by the Voting Rights Act. So the second thing I want to talk about on the national stage is the Voting Rights Act. You know, earlier this summer, the US Supreme Court surprised some people and codified Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And what that means is when you redistrict going forward in the future, and certainly this was the case in 2021 nationally, you have to protect the rights of voters of color through the redistricting process. And so it's a little bit more complex. A lot of times people will, when they're new to redistricting, will assume that this Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act requires that you draw as many districts as possible, maximizing racial and ethnic minority populations. That's not true. That's actually unconstitutional as well. There's a really careful test you have to do called the Jingles test that legislators had to do and that commissions had to do, where they go through and they assess, is there racial polarization in voting in the state? Do candidates frequently preferred by, say, Black voters lose regularly to, let's say, white voters? And so that was the case that came before the Supreme Court. Alabama had drawn their congressional redistricting lines. There's 7 congressional districts. They drew one district that packed Black voters pretty heavily into the 7th district, and then white voters were heavily in the surrounding districts. And a suit came forward that that was a violation of the Voting Rights Act, and that's what the Supreme Court agreed with. That's currently in some lower court, we'll see what happens in terms of how the legislature responded in the lower courts. But I think one national thing that's going to be sticking with us for a while is the importance of protecting voting rights, but also national constitutional criteria that also prohibits racial gerrymandering. So those are two separate things. The last thing I wanted to talk about is that from a national perspective, and whether you're at the local level or the state level, or you're thinking about new policies that you might want to introduce, there is now so much variation across the states in how the process is done that I think there's a lot of institutional rules that we now know work better or worse in different places. And so, it used to be adopt a commission or not was a policy choice that states were making, but now the choices are, do we change how the legislature draws the lines? Do we include appointees of the legislature? Do we have truly independent commissions like Michigan and California? And there's just a lot of different ways to approach this process that I think people should be thinking about as they, perhaps do ballot initiatives at their state or local level to change redistricting processes, and even as they do their own redistricting going forward. And then also with the courts intervening so extensively in redistricting, and this has been the case for decades, but especially, right now, I want to concur with Sara. Commissions have had less court action against their maps. And I know legislators don't always like to give up the power of drawing lines, but from a savings to the taxpayers and avoiding litigation that goes on for a decade, which has happened in states like North Carolina, Pennsylvania in the previous decade, delegating some of the job of redistricting, if not all of it, to commissioners has helped avoid litigation in the states that have commissions.
Thank you so much, Professor Gross. At this time, I'm going to be doing the transition to our questions. So everyone in the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And for now, I'll start off with kind of, a real big, broad question, thinking about best practices here. What worked and what didn't? What can be considered best practices that future commissions will want to incorporate? I think Professor Sadhwani would be a great person to start with that kind of a question.
I touched on this in my earlier comments, but to me, having a rigorous selection process actually was very helpful. Candidates were vetted not only by some sort of legislative body or appointed official, but by the public, right? And the outcome of this, and I write about this in a piece that I wrote at an outlet called The Forum, and I'm happy to send that along to everyone. The outcome is really a field of moderates, right? What we didn't see were extreme Republicans. We didn't see extreme liberals. Instead, we saw a field of people who, yes, might identify as a Democrat or as a Republican, but who had experience working across the lines, who had family members who were of the opposite party, who were open-minded to having conversations with people that disagreed with them. And to me, this is something that ultimately led us to be able to pass this map unanimously. We wanted to work together. And as I write about in this piece, most of the academic studies of redistricting commissions has to do with the outcomes. And there's all sorts of ways of calculating the kinds of outcomes, whether they're competitive, whether they're fair, under a host of different schemes. Instead, in the research that I'm taking on now, it's really looking at who serves as a commissioner, who on earth wants to put themselves out there to receive not a whole lot of money, right? Just enough to maybe buy their coffee and spend hundreds of hours going through census data, working with a bipartisan group while being attacked by the media, by legislators, by community groups, ultimately to pass these maps. It's a field of do-gooders. It's a field of relative moderates who generally want to be doing this work, who believe in their hearts in democracy and upholding our elections and believe in fairness, who actually want to see this process succeed. Certainly that was true in California in this 2020 commission. I think that was largely true in California in the 2010 commission as well. It's people who have a different set of motivations. They are not They do not need to be responsive to a legislator who appointed them. If anything, they're most responsive to the community members who might see them, picking out their produce in the grocery store, who might come up to them and say, how could you draw the lines this way, right? So the establishment, the mindset of a commissioner on a citizen commission is going to be significantly different from those of partisan commissions. And this is something we're thinking a whole lot about when it comes to best practices. I'm involved now in an effort to help form an independent redistricting commission in the city of Los Angeles. As some of the participants here today might recall, there were leaked recordings last fall of a redistricting conversation. It was pretty crass, it was pretty ugly, and we really saw what happens in those backroom negotiations. To me, there was plenty in that conversation that actually sounded very familiar. The jockeying between different communities for representation absolutely happened at the state's commission. It just happened publicly, and the community was actually able to weigh in, and commissioners had to serve as that balancing act between those different groups. So I think, to me, that transparency is key, as well as that rigorous selection process that is also conducted transparently so that the public can weigh in. In California, we have a host of community groups from all different political backgrounds that are very much engaged at every level. Sacramento has a very strong and robust level of interest groups that were absolutely involved in this process that led to many of these kinds of outcomes because they were able to weigh in through the public comment process.
There's so much to reflect on with everything that was just covered there. I've never really given much thought to just, who is the type of person that wants to be on this sort of a commission. That's really very interesting insights. Marjorie, what worked, what didn't in Michigan?
Well, several things I think that we can contrast with California. For one thing, I think it is probably advantageous for the Secretary of State's office to have responsibility for the kind of support activities that Sara was talking about in terms of setting up a commission and trying to get everything going so that you had the ways to hire people and to do contracts with people and so on. The Secretary of State's office has a budget as part of what the legislature is required to appropriate to support the work of the commission. And so they will deal with the contracts that are out there. The commissioners ask for help with, compactness measures or something like that. Then the Secretary of State's office hires outside experts in that area, and the commission itself doesn't have to do that sort of thing. They did have a budget to hire 4 staff members. So they had 4 actual assigned staff members, but there again, they're working through with the Secretary of State to help navigate the hiring process within the state of Michigan, budget guidelines and so on. So I think that probably is an advantage that Michigan has. On the other hand, the Secretary of State is elected in Michigan. So, there is the potential for people to argue that maybe the Secretary of State is, interfering with the process. So there's, it's kind of a pros and cons there potentially. I would say we're very lucky with the Secretary of State that we happen to have currently. She's a former Wayne State law professor, so used to be our colleague, Ben and I, in the law school. And actually she wrote a book as part of her academic career on secretaries of state nationally. So we have, I would say, probably one of the most qualified secretaries of state in the entire country who was operating this. She got on the bandwagon and was doing everything that the amendment asked her to do while lawsuits were still ongoing that could have scuttled the whole commission. And she had to send out, I believe it was 10,000 applications to solicit people who didn't volunteer. She sent out 250,000 out of her Secretary of State budget. So she was very committed to, we're going to get a pool of applicants and we're going to make this work. She held 59 in-person sessions and 11 town hall meetings to help people who were those unsolicited types of folks whose applications were incomplete, that needed help finding a notary, et cetera, et cetera. So she just facilitated, I would say, above and beyond what was called for. And so at one level, we're highly dependent on the commitment and the expertise of the Secretary of State. And while we're getting this established, until it becomes sort of accepted practice, I think that that's both a pro and a con, so, it could have gone very differently. Just for comparison, Sara mentioned that they had, I believe you said, about 20,000 completed applications. In a much smaller state, we had 9,367 completed applications. And that is largely, I would say, to the credit of the Secretary of State for facilitating people in completing the applications. So the Voters Not Politicians, which is the grassroots organization that spearheaded Michigan's ballot initiative, was a completely volunteer organization. They had one paid staff member, a lawyer. Everybody else was volunteers, and they had policy groups. A University of Michigan law school professor was in charge of the policy groups, and she set up these sort of mini committees. And she also was not paid. She was doing this volunteer, where everybody could have been a, auto worker, a homemaker, et cetera, or a law school professor, submitted their ideas on particular policy topics. And then those got vetted and debated and either included or not included in the final document. So a lot of the stuff that's in the amendment came from non-experts. They did, according to Voters Not Politicians, go talk to people in California and looked at things in California. They decided explicitly against pre-screening applicants and vetting any of the applicants. They decided that it was too expensive. And the restrictions that are in there, I mean, they have a guaranteed budget, but it's not a high budget compared to a lot of other states. It's much less costly than it is in California for Michigan's commission. It's in the ballpark of Arizona kind of costs. So, they're just different kind of pros and cons in terms of the selection process. And I think the cost of the selection process, the time it takes for the selection process, whether you get a representative pool of applicants. Michigan's doing a little bit of a high wire act, relying on random selection. We got lucky this time. We had 2 African Americans on the commission. We had one person of Middle Eastern ancestry. For those who don't know, Michigan has the largest population of Middle Eastern ancestry folks outside of the Middle East, with the city of Dearborn and all sorts of, we have Chaldean. I have had students who speak Aramaic as their first language in my classes. It's very, very Middle Eastern around Southeast Michigan. So, we got lucky on getting some representation. We missed some folks, though. We did not get any Hispanic commissioners, which was unfortunate. We have about 5% of the state is Hispanic. So it's not not as big as African American sorts of populations. We had a housewife with 6 kids. We had a community college student, a retired auto worker. And they, with the support of the Secretary of State staff and the outside experts, they appear to have been able to perform well. And it's sort of a let's restore our faith in, citizen democracy. But there again, we could get unlucky with the luck of the draw. And even though our Secretary of State has the option to weight it, other secretaries of state might not weight the pool. Ours did, because I think it was like 60% of the applicants were over 65. And a majority were male. And so she weighted by age, gender, ethnicity, region of the state. But that's optional for the Secretary of State. So I would say somewhat dependent on having a really good, public-minded, fair Secretary of State in our process.
Thanks, Marjorie. Professor Gross, best practices.
I think Professor Sadhwani had a follow-up, or my
Oh,
reading,
please.
and then
I
I'll
didn't see a hand. I'm sorry.
just a very quick reflection on that. I think it's
Please.
fantastic, you know, and I think you do have a great Secretary of State, but I think it also leaves so much to chance, right? Essentially, when we establish these kinds of institutions, which essentially a commission is, we're talking about a process that's going to be used presumably forever after. And I think that does leave a whole lot to chance. It's one of the things we're thinking a whole lot about in the establishment of a commission for the city of Los Angeles, is how to insulate a commission from as much politics as possible. And this is certainly one of the things that we're in consideration of, is can it be upon an elected officer at all, right? I mean, how do we insulate a commission from that? Because I'll say, even in the instance of the state of California, we as commissioners really felt even the staff members that we received in the very beginning had their own agendas, guiding us towards hiring certain kinds of candidates as our staff members. So I think it's a really fine balance and a difficult dance to be as independent as possible, while at the same time, as you note, right, like the offices that are already established, of course, are going to know how to do public outreach, how to work government contracts in ways that we simply did not know how to do. But thank you.
Thank you. Professor Gross.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of your question, what worked and what didn't, I agree with everything I've heard. There's some really interesting differences between Michigan and California that I think are worth thinking about. And I'm not totally sold on which one works better. So Michigan has the selection process of randomly encouraging people to apply. Secretary Jocelyn Benson did a great job of outreach. California has this much more detailed process of the state auditor interviewing people, considering all sorts of different criteria and experiences. And then in both states, the legislature gets to strike some names right near the end of the process. And so that's an interesting institutional rule that I think does work, because, you know, it's a way for it's like the one thing where legislators get to weigh in on a commission process, and they get to basically do opposition research. If there's somebody who's really bad that kind of made its way through to the semifinal stage, they might get bumped at that stage. But, you know, the selection process differs a lot in Michigan and California. And I really think valuing expertise like California does is really good, because you end up with people who have voting rights, civil rights, quantitative experience, have experience working with other people, have management experience. But then Michigan's is fair, because everyone has an equal chance, more or less, to get drawn out of the pool. So I think a balance between those two, and California does have a random component to it as well, I think is something people should think about in terms of what worked going forward. What didn't work as well, I think if we just look at commission states, and I'm thinking here Arizona, Colorado, California, and Michigan, I think the larger the commission, like a Michigan or a California style, is the right way to go. I don't know if you want to go much bigger than 13 or 14 people. That's the number of people who are on the Michigan and California commission, but Arizona's is 5. And 2 of them are appointed by Republican legislators, and 2 are appointed by Democrats. And then those 4 select a 5th independent, right? And there's 1 person who's the independent, and that's not a lot of independent left. There's depending on what happens. So I really think you need more than 5 people. I think the Arizona process is weaker from a commission standpoint. It's like someone I know has described it as the beeper to the cell phone of commissions, right? So it's something from the 1980s that maybe is not the design you would use if you were going to choose how to do a commission in 2023, but there's still a lot of things that worked. Public transparency meetings were held. What didn't work in the redistricting process in 2023 broadly? I think a lot of states didn't pay attention to voting rights considerations. And I think some states engaged in racial gerrymandering. So, you know, starting with Alabama, which has been before the Supreme Court said that they violated the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, as we already discussed. That's going to have implications on a number of other states that didn't really consider voting rights. You know, places like Texas, 95% of the population growth over the last decade in Texas has been from Black and Latino and Asian American voters. And Texas kind of drew lines sort of like they did 10 years ago. And there's no major change in the districts in terms of having majority minority districts or districts that have an opportunity to elect Latino voters preferred candidates and Asian American voters preferred candidates and Black voters preferred candidates. So I do think there's places that, you know, and there's litigation, you know, going forward on this that really didn't think about the Voting Rights Act. And I think most of the time those were states that legislatures drew the lines. We don't know what was decided, you know, as citizens who pay attention to redistricting in the United States, because a lot of it's done behind closed doors. But I think that's one of the things that didn't work. And several legislatures, you know, places like Georgia, possibly South Carolina too. And I think that's something. And the last category of what worked and what didn't is, I will say, there's a few places that just redistrict all the time. And I don't know if that works or it doesn't, but I think that's a national trend we're going to be seeing. Like places like North Carolina, going back to the 1990s, have redrawn their lines almost every 2 to 3 years due to litigation. I don't think that's good, but I also think that you know, if there are problems that have been done in places like North Carolina, having litigation to sort of solve the problems and redraw the lines is a good idea. So, you know, to conclude, I think commissions worked well compared to legislatures. How commissions work differs a lot. The Voting Rights Act, I don't think, was followed in some states the way that it should have been. And then in general, we should be prepared for continued redistricting in the middle of decades.
Well, and that leads up perfect into my next question, thinking about outcomes in Michigan and California and how the commission outcomes compared to other states that relied on legislatures to redraw their legislative boundaries. Marjorie, have you had a chance to look and kind of compare results, thinking about what we saw in Michigan versus other states that are still using legislatures?
I've looked at a few states that I think we would consider pretty heavily gerrymandered. Wisconsin and Ohio come sort of immediately to mind. Both of those states, if you had a less legislature driven, and Ohio technically has a commission, but it's elected officials and appointees of the legislature. It's not a citizen commission. So if you had a citizen commission, so let me revise that statement, you would get something that would be much more competitive because those are potentially Ohio leaning red, but you know, has much more competition than its U.S. House districts or state House and state Senate districts would lead you to believe. The same with Wisconsin. Wisconsin's legitimately, I would say, a purple state, and its House and U.S. House, state Senate, state House don't look that way. Michigan was in that boat prior to this last map. Michigan, for those who might not know, flipped both of its state legislative chambers, and in a sort of huge earth-shattering 2018 2020 sort of House seats, they had managed to flip 2 House seats fairly narrowly, but with considerable effort and turnout that was eye-popping. They had higher midterm election turnout in 2018 in the 2 seats where they flipped the districts. They had more than 100% of the turnout they had in the previous presidential election. So there was just huge boots on the ground effort, and it was largely a Trump backlash, particularly in one of those districts. So, you know, it really changed the outcome for Michigan. I think someplace like Wisconsin and Ohio, if they had a true citizen commission, you would see very different compositions of their legislative elections.
Thanks, Marjorie. As a reminder, any questions in the Q&A, you know, anyone in the audience wants to ask, feel free, and we'll be able to answer live. But I want to give Professor Sadhwani also a chance here to answer that question, how outcomes in California compared to other states that relied on legislatures to redraw their legislative boundaries. How should we think about making comparisons here?
I mean, I think there's plenty of ways. I think one of the key components is that the criteria used in different states can vary. I know Marjorie talked about competitiveness. Competitiveness is a criteria that is used in many states. It is not one used in California. We have a very specific set of 6 criteria that were adopted and are enshrined in our state's constitution, which include things like adherence to equal population, the Voting Rights Act, compactness, keeping communities of interest together. Competitiveness is not one of them. So I think despite that, we actually have several congressional districts that are highly competitive, some of the most competitive in the nation in California, simply because of how we drew the lines using communities of interest testimony. You'll find places in the Central Valley, even in northern Los Angeles County and Orange County, being highly competitive seats. That being said, I don't think it would be fair to use that as a criteria to compare and contrast California to other states, even just given the voter registration of California, which certainly skews towards Democrats throughout the state. Instead, I think, as I mentioned before, California really looks at some of our other accomplishments in terms of being able to keep communities of interest together, our adherence to the Voting Rights Act in ways that I think perhaps hadn't necessarily been considered in the past. Through the commission process, we conducted extensive racially polarized voting analysis for the groups that would be covered under the Voting Rights Act. And those are predominantly Latino and Asian Americans in California, given the state's demographic profile. And we dramatically expanded opportunities for Latino as well as Asian representation throughout the state, while maintaining those protections for African Americans, even in places sometimes where there wasn't necessarily a VRA consideration to do so. But certainly we received significant communities of interest testimony asking that the community be kept together to form coalition districts, if you will, with other communities. So I think those for us are some of the key considerations. But California, of course, is a fairly different place than many other states. We're a very large place, but our criteria, I think, are somewhat different than other places. And this became the competitiveness piece in particular became a point of contention when some advocates were calling for us to adopt a competitiveness criteria. Many civil rights and social justice groups throughout the state weighed in, saying absolutely not, that could run counter to some of our requirements under the Voting Rights Act if we were to try and have those two competing criteria, particularly for one that's not even codified in our Constitution.
Thank you. Professor Gross?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things that where outcomes differed, if we think about things nationally, commission states really did deliver different outcomes than legislative drawn states on a few different dimensions. One of them that I think is really worth pointing out is just, and I talk about this in the report that I put in the chat, did the lines from the last decade look like the lines that were newly drawn in 2022? And commission states had much less overlap with the prior lines than legislative states. So basically legislatures are drawing lines that are really resembling what happened last decade. And then commissions, like Marjorie showed, they pretty much reshaped the map. The commissions were not as bound to the lines that had previously been drawn. So, in all of the 4 states, Arizona, Colorado, California, and Michigan, lines overlapped to about 67% with previous geography. And then in the rest of the states, primarily drawn by legislatures, lines overlapped by closer to 75% or more. And then that's specific to each state as well. California, you saw less overlap between the old districts and the new districts than you did with legislatures drawing the lines in the past and legislatures drawing the line in 2022. Another outcome I think is important, and I don't know if you call this an outcome because it's actually sort of part of the process, but I still think it's important. As a scholar, I've done a lot of work on what's called descriptive representation, the election of people by race and ethnicity and gender and different, descriptive characteristics that people identify. And to me, what's fascinating about the commission processes in most of the states is they were more diverse than legislatures are. In California, there was the huge controversy that Sara talked about where in a very high Latino state, there were not Latino commissioners initially chosen, but then eventually were chosen through the process. But if you look at California, the majority of the commission was women. The majority of commission in Michigan was women. Colorado's was very gender balanced in terms of its members, and also quite a bit of diversity. You know, Arizona had a Native American commissioner, racial and ethnic diversity on the California Commission in particular in the final group of 14, and then in Michigan as well. And you just don't see that when the state legislatures draw the lines. You know, only one legislature in history has had state legislatures have been majority women. That's Nevada, who also redrew their lines in 2021. But I think sometimes when you have new institutions that are kind of created recently instead of a long time ago, you end up getting a lot of basically new people coming in and redrawing the lines. And with commissions, there's just much more diversity in terms of who's drawing the lines.
Thank you. At this moment, I'm going to take a question from the audience here. Marjorie, I think this one will be a good one for you. Could you speak about the compensation commission members receive in Michigan? Could receiving payment for redrawing the lines be negatively perceived by the public due to the required transparency?
Well, I suppose the public could perceive it that way. The amendment, which had explicitly amounts in there, passed with 61% of the vote. So either people didn't read it very carefully and didn't realize they were going to be compensated, or it didn't bother them. And it's not a huge amount of money. It's 25% of the governor's salary, which was, I believe, $39,000 roughly. Now they had, let's see, I'm trying to think. I believe it was with the Zoom meetings and everything that they did with public meetings, it was 138 of those sorts of meetings. And then, yeah, so, I mean, if you start dividing it out, I'm not convinced that they're making minimum wage. And given that, we had a fair number of people who had other jobs and responsibilities, I suspect they may have had to take some leave time. I mean, there were a sizable number of people who were retired because that was a big part of the pool. But with the Secretary of State weighting it, we ended up with community college students and, people who had like in their 30s who had a full-time job. So I don't think you would get people who would be willing to do this without being willing to pay them. And so I think it's actually important. Now, if the voters get upset about that and want to raise issues about it, we can try another ballot initiative to amend the amendment. And if I were going to amend the amendment, I wouldn't focus on that. I would focus on, and this is going to sound bad coming from a political scientist, but I would make it slightly less transparent, because in Michigan there were some lawsuits about the fact that they met behind closed doors with a lawyer to seek legal advice, and that's prohibited. There can be no meetings behind closed doors. And because there are lawsuits ongoing and the commission's still meeting, I can't go off and interview the commissioners because they're not allowed to talk to anybody outside of a public meeting about any of this. If there were cybersecurity issues or personnel issues or anything, those all have to occur in public. And sometimes those are sensitive issues. I would want it narrowly cast. I would want the actual process of the line drawing and those discussions to be public. But I do think there, again, like with the support of the Secretary of State, there's pros and cons to how public this is and how unsupported it is from the folks who know how to make the contracting process move. So I would probably carve out a few little places like that, but I would not change the amount of money that they're being paid. The one thing that I think does bother some people is as long as the lawsuits are ongoing, the commissioners are all still being paid. So as these lawsuits drag out, the legislature, there was some publicity about the fact that they had to appropriate another tranche of funding of 25% of the Secretary of State's budget plus 25% of the governor's salary for all the commissioners. And when you're grinding forward on a lawsuit that can take a couple years, I could see that people would be a little frustrated about that sort of issue. But, you know, that's sort of like lingering breadcrumbs, and I'm not sure over time, hopefully we won't have lingering lawsuits. I think it's largely that it's the first time out, and there's a lot of testing of the waters and trying to figure out where the boundaries are right now.
Thanks, Marjorie.
Can I add on this a little bit?
Please. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is really important, going back to the selection criteria too. So in the report I did, I interviewed several commissioners in California. I interviewed past commissioners, and all the commissioners said, don't pay us very much. You need to be motivated by civic duty. I mean, of course they would be fine with being paid, but they're like, why am I here? It's because I want to make a difference. I want to draw fair maps. I want to engage in the civic process. But when I interviewed advocacy groups and people who care about, you know, fair maps, but on the ground and not on the commission, they're like, you got to pay more because it's a deterrent to get people to do it. You can't get, you know, lower income people who have jobs, who can't just take a year off and to do 9-hour meetings right at the end of the process. That's a deterrent to getting a more diverse group of people from an income perspective. So I think it's something, if you are thinking about this, you want to pay people enough to encourage people to apply, but you don't want to pay people so much that they're no longer motivated by their civic duty or their civic engagement. And that needs to be the key motivation to get commissioners to take part. But if you pay people nothing, you're going to end up with retirees and higher income people who can afford to basically take a year off to do a commission.
Thank you. Sara, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that has been said. Some level of compensation is absolutely essential. In California, the model is a per diem for each day worked. And I think that was essential for myself, though I am a working professional, I'm also a working mom, right? So receiving a per diem was really helpful to get childcare so that I could participate in meetings that went on till 11 p.m. at night and working on nights and weekends. So I agree with everything that's been said. I think that some level of compensation, I don't think anyone is becoming a redistricting commissioner to get rich. You know, this is a short-lived commitment, but it requires an extraordinary amount of time. So I think some level of compensation is essential to ensuring a diverse pool of individuals to serve in this capacity.
Thank you so much. I have a question. We've talked an awful lot about, you know, different like kind of partisan fairness, but I'm kind of curious just to reflect a little bit on the primaries. What are the differences between Michigan and California's primary election system, and were they affected by the commissions? Marjorie?
I don't know that I can say that Michigan's primaries were necessarily affected by the commission. But I would say that we have serious problems with our primary system. Unlike California, we don't have a primary system that produces two viable candidates for the general election. So when a safe district is drawn, say one that has a 70 or 80% base vote for one political party, the primary really is the election. The November election is a coronation, and primary turnout in Michigan tends to be about 20% of the voting public. And so if, as is the case in both of the districts that take in large parts of Detroit, you have a very safe Democratic district, even with, you know, the changes with the Redistricting Commission, it's instead of being 85% base Democratic vote, it's 70% base Democratic vote. It's still a safe Democratic seat. So whoever wins the Democratic primary is almost undoubtedly going to win in November. And so you have people flocking into that primary, as many as 8 candidates in one of the primary elections. And so the person who won got 23% of the vote of the 20% of the people who showed up. that is a very long way from a majority statement of the preferences of the district. And so then that person goes on as the sole Democratic candidate in the November election, and the Republican is very unlikely to beat that person. And so you have a system where at a point in time where a lot of voters don't realize that they really need to be paying attention, the decision is made on who to elect in November. That I think we need to revise. We could have ranked choice voting in primaries. We could have, runoff elections. We could have nonpartisan, elections where you have the top two candidates out of a jungle primary in November. There are all sorts of different ways you could fix that. But I would argue that we have needed to fix that for a very long time because the people who win in some of those very narrowly contested elections win by 100 or so votes. And I don't find that to be a compelling statement of what the voters really want in that district. And it's one of the things that has resulted in both of Michigan's Detroit districts not having African Americans represent them, because the one non-African American primary candidate won in the primary. So we have a Palestinian American representing one of those districts, and she's very popular now. She's been in office. She does a great job with her district. But if you're looking for descriptive representation, that district is heavily African American. And she won the first time because there were multiple African American candidates, and she got like 25% of the vote or so. The same is true currently with an Indian American congressional seat for the other Detroit district. 8 people in the primary, 7 African Americans, 1 Indian American. He gets 23% of the vote. He's a shoo-in in November. So I'm not completely convinced that descriptive representation is always more important than substantive representation. And I think both of those people in Congress have been really committed to trying to represent their district. But on the other hand, I think there are things where we've passed a Voting Rights Act to ensure that people have opportunities to elect people who look like them. And then the primary system undermines that completely.
Thank you so much. Any other comments on this question?
Okay. Sarah, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay. Yeah, I was
That's
just gonna
what
say,
happens on Zoom. We don't know who.
yeah, I mean, so California does have a different primary system, and it's called the top 2 primary, and it's also used in places like Washington. A similar variant is used in Louisiana, where the same people advance regardless of party, and all the voters vote in round 1. And so, I live in Los Angeles, and my district has a ton of Democrats, no matter what. Democrats are going to win, but sometimes we end up having 2 Democrats on the ballot in the general election. And then if you go way out in the rural areas, California, you have 2 Republicans sometimes in the general, because the system is just really different. There's other variants too that Marjorie talked about. The one thing on Michigan that I think is really interesting that I want to talk about with voting rights, though, and maybe I'll disagree slightly with Marjorie if that's okay. I do think that for voting rights protection, you don't have to elect a legislator who's of the same race as voters. It really is about the candidate of choice. Often that is the case. Black voters' preferred candidates is a Black candidate. But like in Michigan, Rashida Tlaib, the lawyer, and Lisa Handley, the VRA expert for the commission, found that Tlaib was preferred by Black voters in primary elections and general elections, as I recall. And one of the cool things about commissions is they often make things more transparent. And I could read that report because they made some of it public. I don't know if it still is, but at the time. And so I think that's a really good example of when we're talking about Alabama and other places where there is often a Black-white context. Frequently a Black candidate of choice is someone who is Black, and Black descriptive representation results from enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. But sometimes voters, like in Michigan, say, that there's a preference for candidates who are not Black. And for Tlaib, she actually she's an instance where there was not a finding of racial polarization. voters across racial and ethnic lines, and her district supported her, which would mean if you drew a large Black district in Michigan, you'd be racial gerrymandering in violation of Miller versus Johnson and places like that. So, if you're a redistrictor out there and you're thinking about race and VRA, it's really complicated because the Voting Rights Act requires under certain conditions that you draw opportunity districts. But then if you have cases like Talib, where there is support being drawn across communities of color and white voters, then you'd be racial gerrymandering if you start maximizing Black districts. So, but the main point is, I think, it's pretty complex environment that we have to think about, and primaries to put a different layer on it too.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And the one caveat is when Talib first ran, she ran for Conyers' seat when he had to resign, and there was a special election at the same time that there was the US for the 2 years. There was a smaller number of African-American candidates who ran against her in the special election. She did not win that one. She won the one for the 2-year seat. Subsequent to that, I would argue that she has been an outstanding advocate for her district in Detroit, and she is wildly popular. And, kudos to her for doing an outstanding job. But initially in that first one, if you had had a different set of rules about the primary, she probably wouldn't have won, because the special election actually is a naturally occurring experiment for the different rules, and she didn't win. So I don't necessarily, in fact, I actually testified in front of the commission for my 2 minutes about the fact that you didn't need 50% because of the term limits cases where we had a huge number of African-American folks who won in majority white districts after term limits. So Michigan probably that Jingles test, we probably are not fully racially polarized, but the whole logic of that, who is it that the voters really want? And the easiest places to point to are in Detroit, where you have these 8, 10, 15 person primaries where somebody wins with like some amount of the vote. But yeah, I totally agree with you. It's just, and I'm not fully convinced that descriptive representation is more valuable than substantive representation. I'm torn by that. But I like your system better, I would have to say. Because you have a contest in November, there's like something happening when voters are actually paying attention.
Thanks, Marjorie. Professor Sadhwani, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think just to chime in, I'm always excited when there's a day when we can talk about substantive versus descriptive representation. Just to chime in, I think this is absolutely the kinds of considerations that we were looking at in California. I think Los Angeles is probably in my opinion, one of the most challenging places to redistrict in the country, given the significant racial diversity of the city and of the county itself. So when we're drawing, we're absolutely thinking and performing the analysis around racially polarized voting to take a closer look at how different communities form vote coalitions with others. And certainly, there are many places where we find evidence that Latinos are voting in support of Black candidates, where Asian Americans are supporting Latino candidates, and vice versa. So I think all of these are really some of the considerations that we'll need to be continuing to dive into even more deeply 10 years from now in the 2030 round of redistricting, as these kinds of phenomenon continue to take root, as the coalition of communities of color working together and having representation from various kinds of legislators continues to shift and change. I think this isn't going to be very much an ongoing conversation. A couple of thoughts around your original question about how primaries were impacted. Yes, California runs a top 2 primary. For us, we were actually very much impacted by the census delay. We had a strong push from community advocates saying, push the California Supreme Court to give us more time on our mandated date of completion of the maps so that communities have more time to digest the data and weigh in. We really went back and forth. Many of us felt like, well, we have enough time, we can make this work. But our deadline for the maps actually fell right around the Christmas holiday. So we did go back to the California Supreme Court asking for additional time. Were we to receive that time, it would have pushed the primary election later into the summer, which was also not seen as ideal, particularly for communities of color as well, because we tend to see low turnout anyway in those primary elections. The Supreme Court said no. We kept to our deadline that ran right around the new year and the holidays. And the primaries were maintained. The date of those primaries were maintained, but that was one other way. Certainly our structure is quite different as Christian laid out, but that was another kind of way. The other piece that I thought I would just mention, not necessarily due to the institution of our primaries, but more so in terms of the term limits as well. Of course, during COVID, we heard about people quietly quitting in the state legislature. We heard about the Great Resignation because following redistricting, we saw, I believe it was up to 25 or 26 different members of the state legislature deciding not to run again. Most of those legislators would have been up against term limits, which is a 12-year time period within the next 2 years. And given the reformulation of their districts, legislators in California are required to live in their legislative districts. So we saw a whole host of folks deciding not to run again after redistricting because their constituency changed significantly and they didn't feel it was worth it to spend that time only to serve for another 2 years and then hit their term limit in any case. So we saw a lot of turnover of our legislature, in part due to that kind of the primary challenges that they would have faced due to the redistricting that occurred.
That's so interesting. Thank you. I'm looking also at the Q&A. One question, I'm guessing we have somebody from Maryland that is in the participants. And the question is that Maryland has been redistricted and it has a super Democratic majority and the Republicans are a minority's minority. Do we think that could be remedied? Do we have anybody within the panelists that know a little bit about the process in Maryland?
I don't know too much about Maryland,
Stumped us.
unfortunately.
I don't know a ton, but I could talk a little bit. I mean, so the description is true. It's a very, other than Larry Hogan, who was a Republican that was governor of the state until recently, the state's very Democratic in terms of its voters, and the legislature is a supermajority Democratic legislature or near it, depending on the year. And they engaged in the redistricting process. There has been some litigation in Maryland. I haven't followed where it's gone recently, but I know there had been some historically, and then during 2021 as well, arguing that it was a partisan gerrymander. But with Ruscio v. Common Cause, which is a case I think in 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court said you're actually able to engage in partisan gerrymandering. So some of those lawsuits in Maryland, I think, have been pulled back, as well as a bunch of other states. And Maryland was one of the states that was discussed during the Ruscio case. So Maryland was basically a Democratic gerrymander, and Wisconsin was basically a Republican gerrymander, and those were the two that were brought forward there. But I'm not as familiar with what happened since. One solution though, if is the commission process that we're talking about. There's lots of pros and cons to different ways to form a commission, but having some sort of commission is one way. I think that's unlikely to happen in Maryland, given the politics on the ground in the state. But another thing would be greater transparency, greater public inputs, any process that might be able to allow people to testify about their own communities could make a difference in places like that.
Thanks, Christian. Another question I see in here, and I do this joke all the time, but an anonymous attendee is just in everything. I mean, every webinar, I always find anonymous attendee, just the most prolific attendee. And just curious, what defines an independent commission member, and how is abuse of that label prevented?
I can take a stab at that. I mean,
Sure.
I think You know, as we discussed previously, you know, from a political science perspective, we'll often think about the difference between an independent commission and a partisan commission of some sort, which has appointees. So I think a part of an answer to that question is in terms of the structure of the commission itself. Is the commission independent from the legislature, from the body in which it's drawing those maps? I think this plays out, though, in perhaps some softer sort of behavioral ways of do commissioners behave in ways that suggest their independence? I mean, I think that certainly comes up. We had in the California Commission accusations that we weren't being independent enough at one point due to the census delay. We had to talk to the legislature about the, you know, whether or not that primary election, as I mentioned, would be pushed back. There were articles written about the meetings that were had, even though lawyers were present. It wasn't with legislators themselves. And it, you know, we had members, their lawyers and advocates come to our public meetings. So I do think that there is something about how commissioners conduct themselves, in addition to kind of the institutional structures that would make a commission independent. There is something about how commissioners actually conduct themselves that will bring confidence in the process altogether. I mean, when people are watching, do they feel like commissioners are behaving in independent ways? I spoke recently with the San Francisco Commission on Elections, and they were saying, you know, it was a partisan commission, and suddenly at 3 a.m, all of the commissioners went outside to the parking lot, came back and scrapped their maps. That would suggest not so independent, right? What happened in that parking lot? So behaving in transparent ways, I think, can be a very important component to this, in addition to these sort of institutional structures and rules that we've talked quite a lot about.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, Christian.
Yeah, I want to add a little bit more to that. You know, Sarah's getting at this, the truly independent commissions are independent from the legislature, right? And that's the key part. And so it's not, you know, like in Michigan and in California, you have equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. They might bring their own partisan ideas to the table. It's not that they're independent from the label in which they identify. It's that they're independent from the legislature. And also, when you have the same number of Republicans and Democrats, you got to argue with each other and debate. And you've got 4 independents in California, and you've got 1 independent in Arizona, right? And so to me, a lot of times there's a misuse to assume that there's like independence means someone who's completely neutral and apolitical and has never thought about elections or politics. Because I think most people who get excited about redistricting and apply to be commissioners, they probably thought a little bit about politics. They probably want a fairer process. They want, you know, they don't like the way legislatures do it, right? There's things like that. So independence not really that way. It's more about independent from the legislature. And then the other thing I think is worth thinking about is independence is also sort of in like the approach, right? So it's not necessarily that you know, it's not necessarily that you're coming to a commission with not thought of anything at all in terms of politics, but you're forced in public to argue, debate, take input, and that's really the independent process, not something else. But the misuse of the term independent, I think, happens in other states. So a lot of states that have what I would call a politician commission, you know, legislators appoint people to be on the commission, or legislators themselves are on commissions. They're sometimes mislabeled as independent commissions, but they're not independent commissions because they're not independent from the legislature.
Looks like we have a response.
I wanted to just add in very quickly. As I reread the question, I'm wondering if the questioner was asking about people who are registered as independents. And to that end, I always think about it as independent from the legislature, but rereading the question, yes, right. I mean, certainly from the political science perspective, we rarely believe that there are very many true independents, that many people who will identify as an independent will sway towards either the Democratic or Republican Party rather consistently, though not always. I think that that is an interesting component to this. In California, we have 4 independents, but we have 5 Democrats and Republicans, which means even, if all 4 of those quote unquote independents swayed toward the Republican Party, then the Republicans are going to have greater power in terms of passing those final maps. If they all sway towards the Democratic Party, the opposite would be true. So I think, if reading it from that perspective, I think there can be other components that one might want to think about. I think it's also a part of why independents have that smaller share in the California system. And this is a point of contention, because people who identify as independent or no party preference in California actually outweighs the number of people who register as Republicans. So this is a point of contention in California. And I think, when we look at the structure of Arizona, where the independent essentially has the final vote between Democrats and Republicans, or in Michigan.
Independents are the largest group in Arizona. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Or in Michigan, where they're the largest number. I mean, certainly this is a reason to me why you want a rigorous selection process to ensure that when we're getting those independents or no party preference folks, that they are actually balanced or moderate and not actually an extremist on one end or the other.
Marjorie?
Yeah, in Michigan, in the constitutional amendment, there the thing starts out with all the things that you have to attest to. You have to sign a sworn notarized affidavit that these are all true. One of those things is that your party affiliation, whether it's Republican, Democratic, not affiliated with either one of the major political parties, is the way it is worded in the amendment. In Michigan, historically, although it's less true now, but historically, when I teach Michigan politics, I take like survey data going way back when, into the 60s and 70s. Michigan used to be a third Republican, a third Democratic, a third independent. And Michigan is noted for swing voters. Independent voters are allowed to vote in either political primary. You can't vote in both. You have to say which one you're voting in. So it's an open primary system, sort of encourages, independents to participate and to not declare a party affiliation. But the whole first half of a page of this PDF that I'm looking at is that you can't be a parent, step-parent, child, stepchild, or spouse of any individual disqualified under parts 1B of this section, which is a whole list of you can't have in the past years been a declared candidate for any partisan state or federal or local office. You can't have worked for any legislative candidate. You can't have been a lobbyist or associated. It's just this litany of things you can't do. And you are not allowed to do them if you are a commissioner for 5 years subsequent to serving on the commission. So they were very vigorous and committed to this. And then you do have to sign and have notarized a statement. You can obviously look at people's campaign finance records and check to make sure they're not on somebody's old volunteer list. And probably the opposition research would definitely go after people if they found a commissioner who had violated that. So it is not just sort of casually, I just go either way. It's like you have to legally have said, I'm not, and I have not done any of these things, and I won't do any of them for the next 5 years.
Thanks, Marjorie.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I think I'm going to try to find a way to kind of combine a question that I had prepared, but also a question from my favorite anonymous attendee. So what would be the most efficient way to establish an IRC, Independent Redistricting Committee? So we have somebody that's very sold. And then how likely is it that other states will adopt independent redistricting commissions similar to those in Michigan and California?
I would say for the ballot initiative states has go look at what the voters not politicians folks did in terms of the grassroots work to get a ballot committee going. I actually was part of the sort of tier of people who collected signatures, and it was a system where one of my colleagues was my team leader, and the team leaders recruited people to be on their team, and they were answering to people above them. And it was just a system, almost like if those of you who are old enough remember Tupperware sales. It was that sort of grassroots system, and none of us were paid volunteers. And I mean, we got way more than we needed in terms of the number of signatures. And I think if you just start explaining to people, I went and stood outside U of M stadium on football game days. It's not necessarily the most Democratic leaning crowd, if you're standing outside of sports stadiums. But if you start talking to people about the fact that gerrymandering probably contributes to polarization and gridlock, and that we're setting up a system where voters get to, politicians choose their voters instead of voters choosing their politicians, which was the slogan, people really resonate to that. I can tell you. and we got bumper stickers and we got prizes and things for being the signature gatherer. It was definitely Tupperware party time. But it was done completely with small donations. They only had a few $100,000, and then there was a big state Supreme Court case that was decided on the 31st of August as we were, no, 31st of July, as we were moving into the November election, about whether the thing was going to appear on the ballot. Once the Supreme Court ruled in our favor, everybody in the country poured money in. There were millions of dollars in, like in a month. But up until that point, you really can do it just with those of us who were collecting signatures were donating a couple $100 to pay for the printing of the petition.
Thanks, Marjorie. I hate to nudge in, but we are a little over time, and I want to make sure that Professor Gross and Professor Sadhwani have a chance to answer as well, so we can wrap. Professor Gross, would you like to respond? Do you think other states will adopt these commissions?
I think so. And I think, so to directly respond to the question, what's the most efficient way to get an independent redistricting commission established? I think it depends on where you are, right? So I agree with Marjorie. If you're in a state that has a ballot initiative process and has not already adopted a commission, I think it's possible. That would be places like Arkansas, Oklahoma, Ohio. There are places that have ballot initiative processes. Even Florida, you have to get a 60% vote or higher to change things in Florida. But it is possible to do it in those places. So check, do you have a ballot initiative? If you don't have a ballot initiative process, it's going to be a lot harder. The legislature is going to want to keep control of drawing the lines. What I would do there is see if some sort of hybrid or more open process would be possible that legislatures might go for. I think legislatures that are in somewhat competitive states that are maybe trending away from one party towards another one would probably be the ones most likely to think about some sort of pseudo commission or of somewhat commission process. And then the last thing I think you should do is think about localities. So there's states that are never going to probably have an independent commission. It's just the legislature is not going to do that. Yeah, but cities, counties, they are actually passing redistricting commissions at the local level. And then once they're in use in a number of places, it starts to become something that people are used to. And then it might be a place to start encouraging greater advocacy at the state level.
Thank you. And Professor Sadhwani?
Yeah, just last word. I mean, I think I agree with everything that's already been said. The efficiency piece is really tough because legislators themselves rarely want to give up that power. I agree, where ballot initiatives are possible, the people tend to gravitate towards this because it's almost a no-brainer once it's messaged. Certainly that was the case in California, where Democrats were very much against the idea of independent redistricting commissions back in 2008. The voters, predominantly Democrats, moved forward with it anyway, because it's common sense to want fairness, even amongst those voters who maybe only show up during presidential elections and don't really pay attention to politics. Fairness is something we can all connect with. Sadly, and perhaps maybe just something fun and tongue-in-cheek, it might require scandal. That was the case here in Los Angeles. I don't think that there was much of a movement for an independent redistricting commission for the city of Los Angeles previously. Suddenly now legislators are all on board. Even our mayor is advocating for the push towards an independent redistricting commission, where she had written many letters against the state's commission. So it's fascinating to see how a scandal can change people's minds about this matter, and really put it on the agenda to move forward and advance at a local level. So I'd agree with that, with Christian's perspective there, even in states where that may not otherwise happen.
Well, thank you again. And thank you to all three of our just wonderful panelists. What a great conversation. And for everyone else here, the participants, thank you all for your attendance, for the great questions. Please feel free to visit the Levin Center's website, levin-center.org. We have lots of information about our State Oversight Academy there, more resources, thinking about redistricting, thinking about different sorts of oversight happening at state levels all across the country. And please also subscribe to our newsletter if you are enjoying the conversation, you want to kind of see more of the different things that we have going on here, please feel free to visit and subscribe, and look forward to doing another conversation again soon. Thank you again.